There was chaos all around. Among the collapsed buildings stood a huge monster with purple skin and a skeletal back, from which emitted terrible shadows. Fear and panic filled the streets, but only one lonely guy stands motionless and does not try to run away. People looked at the monster with horror in their eyes and could not understand what was happening. The guy's eyes also sparkled with surprise and fear, looking at the gloomy sight in front of him. His gaze widened in amazement and turned upward. Suddenly, the guy felt that something was happening to his cheek. He looked at it in surprise and saw glowing cracks. Sensing something else, his gaze, full of incomprehension and horror, slid down over his shoulder. His arm was covered in hundreds of cracks, and they were gradually making their way towards his body, as if he was about to explode. Panic gripped the boy. His eyes widened and beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. With a quick movement, he fell to the floor, his gaze feverishly running over his body. The boy's scream echoed everywhere as hundreds of cracks began to tear him apart from the inside, causing him hellish pain. In a moment, everything became quiet. Only a small purple ball of energy sparkled against the blue sky. Gradually, it faded away, sinking downwards. The ball slowly approached the face of the guy who was lying unconscious. The energy object carefully entered the guy's head, disappearing forever into the depths of his consciousness. The dark-haired man's eyes suddenly opened wide and his mouth opened slightly, swallowing more air, clutching the sheet in his fingers. He was still trying to comprehend that this was just a nightmare. The guy slowly sat up on his bed, his black bangs falling slightly over his eyes. He turned to the large panoramic window, trying to finally come to his senses. Echoes of a dream flashed through his memory. The brain was still drawing scary pictures consisting of scary, scaly monsters, under whose feet the city burned with red flame. Panic swept the streets. Everyone ran, terrified, past buildings that were drowning in flames. Some people soared upward like a light feather, and white lightning sparkled around them. Not understanding what was happening, the crowd of people froze in place, watching as others floated in the air. The guy was brought out of his dark memories by a sharp knock on the door. The dark-haired man looked back sharply at the sound, hearing a female voice after asking, "Brother, did it work? Did you awaken your talent?" The guy's thoughtful gaze turned downwards to the palm in which lay the black stone. The surface of the stone was decorated with two bright patterns that looked like circles. From it, a straight bright lightning flashed, and then the inscription, "Low-level talent," appeared. The guy exhaled deeply, closing his eyes, and beads of sweat rolled down his forehead. "If I don't become a warrior, how can I protect my little sister?" he thought. And the black stone fell with a dull thud onto his bare feet. The dark-haired man lowered his head, hunching his back. Suddenly, the door swung open and a girl entered the room with a smile on her face. Her eyes, seemingly without blinking, looked at her brother, and she herself froze in anticipation, timidly asking, "Well, what?" The girl folded her palms into a lock, pressing them to her chest and shifting from foot to foot, asked again, "What is the result?" Without raising his head, the guy grinned and replied, "Excellent, of course." As soon as the sister heard these words, her eyes seemed to shine, and, not believing her ears, she asked again, "Really?" An awkward smile touched the boy's lips, and he quietly replied, "Don't worry, I will definitely become the strongest warrior." The girl jumped high into the air, tucking her legs under her and screaming loudly with joy. "I knew it! My older brother is the best!" The guy's face reflected bewilderment, seeing such a happy sister, while the girl said with a wide smile, "Let's go! I made your favorite dish. We need to celebrate the awakening." Just as the brother was about to follow his sister, a pop-up window with inscriptions appeared in front of him. The guy's eyes widened in surprise, looking at the window that appeared in front of him. He froze in place while his sister, unable to see anything in front of her, put her hands on her hips and said loudly, "What are you waiting for? Move!" It was a status window that had the words Human Nicole, Enhancement Talent, Low, Freezing Talent, Low, Not Awakened. The dark-haired man's eyes grew even wider. He stretched his palm forward, still not believing what was happening. The status window shook sharply, blurring into the air. It glowed blue again, but the inscription changed to Human, Nicholas, Talent for Excellence, Low Level. The guy looked up, looking at the window in surprise. Suddenly, his sister's hand grabbed his wrist, stopping his attempt to touch the status window. Nicole dragged her brother along with her, shouting, "Come on, the food will get cold." She quickly walked forward while Nicholas, slightly confused, tried not to trip over his feet. Two hands clasped together suddenly glowed with a purple light. The status window appeared before the guy's eyes again. It read, Human Nicole, Enhancement Talent, Low, Freezing Talent, Low, can be copied. Nicholas's breathing became ragged. "Can I copy it? How?" flashed through his mind. His fingertips trembled, his lips pressed into a thin line, and his eyes continued to stare forward at the inscription. Do you want to copy talents? Yes or no? After a while, Nicole placed the plate on the kitchen table, a wonderful, inviting aroma emanating from it. This is only a small part of what the girl could cook. She loved to spoil her brother with various dishes. Nicholas took the chopsticks in his hands and sat down at the table, starting to eat. Doubts were swirling around in the guy's head, preventing him from enjoying his breakfast to the fullest. Copying talents is an amazing ability, but I can't try it on my sister. I'll have to click no. Her main talent is better than mine. Freezing is extremely rare. The dark-haired man closed his eyes, chewing on pieces of rice, trying to throw bad thoughts out of his head. Mom, Dad, he thought, looking back. If you're watching us, then you can rest easy. On one of the shelves, there were 2 photographs of the deceased parents. Closer to lunchtime, modern high-rise buildings were already shining in the rays of the sun. Nick's blue sneaker landed on the asphalt, raising a cloud of dust around it. People walked past him quickly, hurrying about their business. The guy cast an indifferent glance at the passers-by around him, but then suddenly stopped, frowning. Purple rings of energy flashed forward like locators. Nicholas scanned every person in his path, but the status window only showed one low-level talent. These talents are no good for anything, the dark-haired man muttered under his breath and continued on his way. With his head down and staring at his feet, he walked forward with a languid, almost thoughtful gait. In an instant, his red eyes looked up and his lips stretched into a sly smile. I have an idea. Nicholas sat a fast pace headed towards the ancient gate leading to a stone building with the inscription 5th Linhai Academy. He looked thoughtfully at all the warriors who were coming out from there. A sly smile touched the corners of his lips again. His fingers gently touched his cheek, and the thought ran through his head. Thanks to my talent, I will surely become the strongest of all here. 10 days later, the Academy's stone courtyard was surrounded by arches and crenellated walls. In the very middle of it, in the lotus position, sat a man, his face distorted with tension, his hands clenched into fists. Nicholas was also sitting in the lotus position, and on his chest was the purple uniform of the Academy. Teacher, a couple of people have fainted, one of the students shouted, pointing to the people lying on the ground. The man's answer was not long in coming. He said loudly, Don't pay attention to these nobodies. You only have a chance to become warriors if you can concentrate your energy. Nick frowned and beads of sweat appeared on his face. The teacher crossed his arms over his chest and looked at the students, his gaze lingering on the boy, and quickly said, That's enough for today. You really are the worst students I've ever taught. The man raised his eyebrows and grinned sarcastically, throwing out a parting shot of, Take an example from Ben. Hearing this name, Nicholas, as if struck, suddenly opened his eyes and stared after the departing coach. After training, Nicholas walked with his new friend along the fountain, looking around the Academy's grounds. Ben is not simple. He became a student in half a month and now he is being personally trained by the head of the Academy. Greg rattled off, running his eyes over Nick's thoughtful face. The new friend, with a mischievous smile on his face, put his hand in his pocket, pulled out a small piece of paper, and began waving it in front of the guy's nose. On this sheet of paper, a bright and captivating painting of that very Ben stretched out. Greg smiled smugly, as if he was holding a gold bar in his hand and not an ordinary autograph. Nicholas, embarrassed and slightly confused, tried to force an awkward smile, as if he thought that it would somehow smooth over the awkwardness of the moment, since he had no idea what to say in response. Not far from the guys, a crowd formed, raising their hands in the air, shouting, It's Ben! Look faster! Ben has arrived. They, without waiting for the noise to die down, instantly turned their heads in the direction of the screams, full of curiosity and bewilderment. In the very center of this crowd of people stood a fair-haired guy who, with a joyful smile on his face, waved his hand in a friendly manner. Suddenly, Greg ran forward, shouting, Ben, sign for me one more time, leaving Nicholas standing alone. As soon as he noticed the blonde, the guy narrowed his eyes slyly and smiled, showing his snow-white teeth in a sinister grin. Ben, with a cheerful smile on his face, nods vigorously to everyone who approaches him. His status window clearly showed that he had a mid-level talent, which meant that he was already experienced and had gone through many trials. Nicholas, his hands clenched into fists so that his knuckles were white with tension, with determination in his eyes, walked towards Ben. Ben, slightly flushed with embarrassment and with an embarrassed smile on his face, muttered, Okay, guys, calm down. Greg, tripping over his own feet and looking completely awkward, quickly walked towards the blonde man, trying to hide his shy trepidation and nervous excitement. Nick, with a smile on his face and his hand extended forward, asked eloquently, "Can I shake your hand?" There was a long line of people in front of Ben, eager to shake his hand and express their admiration. A proud smile spread across his face as he heard the people around him gushing with admiration. "Buddy, it's your turn," Ben said relaxedly, holding out his hand to Nick. The dark-haired guy slowly lowered his gaze to his palm, as if trying to discern something important in it. A grin immediately appeared on his face, making it clear that he had already planned something. In an instant, their palms touched, and a purple glow erupted between them, so bright that it seemed as if they had touched electricity itself. Nicholas, at the moment he touched Ben's left hand, copied his talent for self-improvement, and then quickly pulled his hand back. The blonde man shook hands with a couple more people and hurried away, waving his hand one last time. "It worked!" flashed joyfully through Nick's mind, and he couldn't help but smile. By evening, the weather had become so bad that a real storm broke out outside the window. Thunder rumbled and rain poured down, flooding everything around. There was a status window in front of the guy's eyes, and it displayed the question, "Mid-level cultivation talent successfully copied. Start merging? Yes or no?" Nick, sitting on the hard ground in the cold and gloomy cave, stared thoughtfully at one point. He unconsciously ran his fingers over his chin, and suddenly vague echoes of the terrible nightmare that had been haunting him surfaced in his head. That same scream that echoed and hundreds of cracks tore him apart from the inside, causing hellish pain. What did it mean? Nick asked, staring into space, but no answer came. He looked back at the status window where the button was blinking and, gathering his thoughts, he pressed yes with determination. The dark-haired guy, having settled comfortably on the damp ground, crossed his arms in front of him and completely relaxed. A sharp pain shot through Nick's body. His palm quickly dropped to his chest and lightly squeezed the fabric of his uniform. Unable to bear the unbearable pain any longer, Nicholas screamed, throwing his head back. Suddenly he fell sharply to his knees, pressing his palms to the ground. His fingertips scraped the wet surface, pushing dirt under his nails. "It hurt like hell," Nick said, through clenched teeth. The weather outside simply got worse beyond belief. The sky became even darker, and lightning tore it apart. The pain receded, and Nick could breathe deeply. Beads of sweat were visible on his face, and his mouth was slightly open in an attempt to catch at least some fresh air. His eyes quickly moved upward, noticing his status window. Human, Nicholas, cultivation talent, average. As soon as the guy read these lines, his face suddenly lit up with a wide smile. His status window suddenly became foggy and blurry with one easy movement. A new one appeared in front of the guy, which read, "Copy talent cooldown, 30 days. His eyes widened in surprise as soon as he finished reading the inscription. Taking a deep breath, he sat more comfortably in the lotus position and closed his eyes, muttering under his breath, "I'll do the exercise that the teacher showed us." In front of him, in an instant, the glowing lines swirled together into one small ball, resembling a clot of energy. Nicholas's eyes were filled with admiration, and he exclaimed, "With an average talent, doing the exercise is easy." Rising from the cold ground, he walked slowly towards the exit of the cave. A victorious smile played across his face as drops of rain fell on his face. A month later, when night fell upon the city, a huge full moon shone in the sky, illuminating the streets. Like a shadow, a huge monster, reminiscent of a wolf with its massive paws and fierce eyes, swept over the rooftops. He bared his teeth, growled with impatience, and looked greedily for his prey. At that moment, a little girl was slowly walking down a quiet street, holding tightly to her father's big, warm hand. As he passed them, Nicholas was deep in thought, clutching the lantern tightly in his hand and looking at his feet. There was a loud splashing sound down the street, and then something fell heavily onto the asphalt. The man didn't even have time to squeak before the huge monster grabbed his face with its sharp fangs. Nicholas turned around at the sound, and his eyes widened as he saw the man's corpse and the monster nearby. "Daddy!" the blonde girl screamed, looking at her father's lifeless body. The beast turned sharply towards her, scratching the asphalt with its sharp claws, preparing to attack. Nick began to get nervous, and beads of sweat began to shine on his forehead. When passers-by saw this terrible monster, their hearts sank into their heels and panic engulfed the streets. People were screaming and running in different directions. Only the dark-haired one looked at the shaggy monster in fascination, because he had never seen them outside the academy. The beast growled quietly, and bright red blood dripped from its mouth. In an instant, he rushed forward, opening his huge mouth, revealing sharp teeth. Without thinking twice, Nicholas quickly pressed the girl to himself, protecting her from the monster's attack. "He's too fast, I can't escape," the boy thought, shuffling his legs, running away. From somewhere above, a man with a red cloak landed on the ground. His greatsword came down with a loud bang, and the stone slabs on the street were cut into two pieces. The shockwave tried to knock the beast off its feet, but it dug its claws into the asphalt, leaving small indentations. The man's gaze was riveted on the bright red eyes of the monster, which sparkled in the darkness like two hot coals. "Sorry for the delay," he said, a grin playing across his face. "Who are you?" Nick shouted, still holding the girl in his arms. "Everyone calls me Captain Windwolf," the man replied. He turned around and looked at the dark-haired man, throwing him an order. "Leave the Silver Moon Wolf to me and you protect the girl." "Got it," Nicholas replied, hugging the blonde tighter. The captain quickly ran towards the wolf, leaving behind a ball of dust. He swung his sword, raising it over the beast's head. Nick placed his palm over the girl's eyes, blocking her view of the fight, and quickly muttered, "Don't look. He's strong, the bastard," the captain croaked, clenching his jaws, and his eyebrows drew together so tightly that it seemed his forehead was about to fold into 3 folds. The sword struck the wolf with a dull sound, sending it flying back several meters. The beast did not retreat. He began to quickly walk around the warrior, raising a cloud of dust around him. The captain, squeezing the hilt of his sword so hard that his fingers turned white with tension, swung it again, aiming straight at the wolf's heart. "I'm not alone," the man said through clenched teeth, and several martial artists dropped to the ground. The monster, breathing heavily, looked at the warriors, assessing his chances of victory. All the masters took their swords and clubs and, with fire in their eyes, rushed towards the beast. The ferocious monster, with fury, threw off the warriors with one powerful movement, and bending in the air, swiftly jumped straight to the captain, preparing to deliver the decisive blow. "Captain!" shouted one of the masters, pointing at the huge wolf. The beast approached the warrior with quick and confident steps, its muscles tensing with every step. The man suddenly pulled out his sword, gripping the hilt tightly, and assumed a defensive stance. The monster pushed off the ground and with a wild roar rushed at the dark-haired man, his huge paws threateningly swinging in the air. The martial artists rushed to their captain's aid, clutching their weapons tighter. In an instant, several swords plunged into the beast, leaving behind a splash of blood and a bright gleam of metal. "Is he dead?" asked one of the masters, removing his weapon from the body. Suddenly, the monster's claws began to rapidly lengthen, sparkling in the rays of the full moon. The fur suddenly flared up bright red, and from the depths of the mouth such a powerful roar burst forth that passers-by got goosebumps. "Watch out! The monster has entered a bloody flash state," Captain Windwolf shouted, warning the others. With one blow, the ferocious beast knocked back one martial artist, leaving a bloody stain on his chest. "Captain, how are you?" asked Nick, who was still standing nearby. "Fine," the man shouted back. When the wolf saw that he was in trouble, he rushed out of the encirclement, wanting to run away into the distance. "He's running away!" Nicholas pointed his finger at the beast. The wolf crossed the streets with quick steps, leaving a trail of blood behind him. "Don't worry, it won't run away," said the captain, watching the beast. A mysterious female silhouette suddenly appeared on the roof of one of the houses. The girl, confidently holding a bow in her hands, was also one of the masters. Her light fingers released the bowstring, and the arrow flew with a whistle towards the monster. The arrow, fired with incredible accuracy, flew straight into the beast's eye. By the time he noticed the shiny metal tip, it was too late. The arrow struck the wolf, and as he let out a final hoarse howl, bright sprays of his blood flew around. Then there was a bang, and the monster fell to the ground, completely exposing its figure. The captain laughed quietly, showing his snow-white teeth. "You're still too weak to compete with us." The martial artist crowded around the Silver Moon Wolf, which was a meter long, had sharp claws and red eyes. Nicholas's eyebrows rose when he noticed the status window popping up. "Are these the monster's talents?" Nick thought as he read the text. Monster, Silver Moon Wolf, Blood Talent, Low, Speed Talent, Basic. His face was blank as he scanned the lines on the status window over and over again. The girl next to Nick folded her palms into a lock and pressed them to her breasts, looking at the masters with fascination. Suddenly, a clawed paw fell on the asphalt, leaving deep scratches. Despite the fact that the animal was badly wounded and death was already close, it still rose to its feet, breathing heavily. The first to notice the monster was Captain Windwolf, and he shouted loudly to his companions, "Hey you, watch out!" The martial artists quickly turned around at the shout, confusion evident on their faces. The Silver Moon Wolf, wagging its tail, slowly approached the warriors. His loud roar echoed throughout the city, shaking the earth. "Captain, what should we do?" one of the masters shouted, pointing his weapon forward. "Don't worry, the creature is pretty weak, leave it to me," Captain Windwolf shouted and looked behind him, adding, "Hey boy, it's not safe here. Get out of here with the girl immediately." Nick stood rooted to the spot, his mouth open and his eyes wide open, unable to tear his gaze away from the silver-mooned wolf. Then a sly smile appeared on his face, and the thought flashed through his head. This is a great opportunity. Nicholas, in the blink of an eye, rushed past the captain, leaving behind only a light breeze. He swung his fist, cutting through the air around him. The blow hit the beast's face and it whined quietly. The touch was only for a second, but it was enough for the monster's talent to be successfully copied. Nick's fist flared with a bright white light, like 100 lightning bolts. The guy deftly turned over in the air, doing a backflip. Nicholas landed on the beast's back, riding it as if it were a horse. He clenched his fists and raised them high above his head, demonstrating his strength. A second later, they landed on the wolf's back with a powerful blow. There was a loud crunch of bones and splashes of blood flew in all directions. 2 drops of blood fell on Nick's cheek, leaving scarlet marks on his pale skin. The boy's bloody fist shot up again. "Enough! He's dead!" Captain Windwolf shouted and grabbed the dark-haired man by the wrist. Nicholas exhaled heavily and quickly ran his gaze over the bloodstain on the wolf's fur. The dark-haired man removed his second palm from the beast's body, and drops of blood slowly flowed down it. "Okay, we need to clean up here," the captain shouted to his partners. The man nodded to the woman on his team at the blonde girl and added, "And you take care of the girl." Captain Windwolf put his sword on his shoulder and turned to Nicholas. Smiling, he said, "Thank you for your help, boy. I will be very glad to see you in my company when you become a warrior." The guy nodded a couple of times and replied with a happy smile, "Got it." Nick got home only in the evening, when the sun was setting over the horizon. Turning the tap, the dark-haired man stuck his bloody hands under the hot water. While washing his face, the guy washed away traces of blood from his hands and face. The mirror in the bathroom was fogged up from the heat and humidity. Nicholas lifted his face above the sink, and a couple of drops slowly rolled down his skin. Washing away the traces of the furious fight, he placed his palm on the door handle. The door creaked open and Nicholas walked slowly into the living room. Hearing a quiet snore, the dark-haired man turned towards the sound. Nicole slept on a small mattress, placing her palms under her head. "Brother," the girl whispered sleepily, and the corners of her lips twitched. Hearing this, Nick also smiled a soft, kind smile. On the kitchen table, there were already a couple of fragrant dishes that my sister had managed to prepare. The dark-haired man didn't even touch them. Instead, he took a blanket out of the closet. Carefully, he covered his sister with it, wrapping her like a cocoon. Nicole, without waking up, settled more comfortably on the mattress, hugging the warm blanket to herself. To avoid waking his sister, Nicholas quietly entered his room. In the palm of his right hand, he held a towel folded in half. Slowly and tiredly, the dark-haired guy sank down onto the bed. Suddenly, a status window popped up in front of him. Nick's eyebrows drew together and he squinted his eyes to get a better look at the hologram in front of him. Rereading the lines over and over again, he thought, "This will most likely be more painful than last time, maybe even mortally dangerous." But the decision was made. Nicholas, clutching the crumpled towel in his hand, pressed it to his lips and opened his mouth. He clenched the cloth tightly between his teeth, and at that very moment the copying began. From the unbearable pain, the dark-haired man bit into the towel and his eyes opened wide. Unable to contain himself, he collapsed to the floor, bracing himself with his palms. His nails dug into the wooden boards, leaving long marks. There was a buzzing in his head, and the veins in his arms bulged as if they were about to burst. Suddenly, his legs seemed to come to life, starting to convulse, as if someone invisible was sharply pulling at strings. There is a sharp crunch of bones and the foot flies off, leaving behind a fountain of blood. Nicholas screamed so loudly that the cloth he was holding in his teeth flew out of his mouth. With fear in his eyes, the dark-haired man slowly looked around and saw only a bloody stain in front of him. "Did the copying fail?" the guy thought, gulping air. His heart was pounding and beads of sweat were appearing on his forehead, as if he had just run a marathon. The image of his sleeping sister suddenly appeared in his head like a bright flash, so vivid and real that he could almost hear her quiet breathing. "Nicole!" Nicholas shouted, and in an instant everything changed. The room became as bright as day again. The guy sat up in bed, looking around, trying to figure out where he was now. "What happened?" the dark-haired man whispered, and looked first at his palms and then at his legs. Everything was in place. With a quick movement, his leg rose up. "Wow, the body is light as a feather," Nicholas exclaimed, laughing happily. The guy was shocked. He looked at the status window that appeared in front of him. It read, "Human, Nicholas. Enhancement talent, intermediate, speed talent, basic." A couple of days later, in the grove of the 5th Academy, the sound of footsteps was heard. Nick moved his feet quickly. leaving only dust behind him. He rushed through the trees like lightning. With just one jump, he soared high into the air. His eyes glowed with fire as he levitated above the treetops. A happy smile quickly formed on his face. Nick slid smoothly down, his boots barely touching the surface of the rocks. Having miscalculated his strength, he fell to the ground with a crash, leaving a hole and cracks beneath him. Among the other debris that rose up, Nicholas noticed a green leaf. Pushing off the ground with force, Nick began to run. The leaf slowly fell to the ground, hovering in the air. And in the blink of an eye, it lands on the guy's palm. Nicholas sharply squeezes his palm, crumpling the piece of paper in his fingers. The dark-haired man deftly moved onto a large boulder. He took a deep breath and sat down in the lotus position, crossing his legs. The guy closed his eyes, placing his palms on his knees. Suddenly, a painfully familiar voice rang out. "Nick!" It was Greg. Nicholas smiled and opened his eyes, nodding to his friend in greeting. Greg looked the guy over from head to toe, assessing his appearance. "Wow, you're so strong, you've already become a student." The guy laughed and patted Nick on the shoulder. Then the dark-haired man leaned over and quietly whispered, "Do you know how you can become even stronger in a short time?" Nicholas laughed, answering, "And how?" Greg grinned and looked at his friend, also throwing out, "Ever tried monster blood?" He shook his head. "I'll tell you frankly, I advanced faster than you because I drank it." The guy's tone became ominous, as if he was trying to tell some kind of horror story. Nicholas's eyes widened and he groaned softly, mentally kicking himself in the ass as he remembered that he had missed out on the silver moon wolf's blood. Greg raised his finger to get attention and quickly said, "There's one way to get her. Are you interested?" The dark-haired man immediately perked up and shouted, "You keep asking. Tell me." Greg grinned and cleared his throat, beginning his story. The leadership of the Linhai Academy has unofficially established a zone outside the city, which is used to hold the exams of the 5 academies. The main prize for passing is the blood of a monster. "What level is it?" Nicholas interrupted him, stopping the guy's flow of words. "Quite low. The beasts there were exterminated long ago. Only their subspecies, the monsters, remain." Greg answered, shrugging. Nick thoughtfully placed his fingers to his chin, trying to collect his thoughts into a coherent whole. "While we're on the subject, would you like to join my team and get blood together?" Greg lightly tapped the dark-haired man on the shoulder. "Join your team? I don't even know," Nicholas drawled sarcastically. Greg cried out indignantly, pointing at the guy. "Hey, what do you mean I don't know? I told you this because you're my good friend." Nick smirked as he replied, "Sorry, I'll join you next time." Amidst his friend's muttering, the dark-haired man moved forward. "Nick, wait! Even if you don't join, we'll still be friends. Wait for me!" Greg shouted to the whole area and quickly shook hands with his friend. Nicholas seemed not to hear him, walking forward thoughtfully. A month later, the sun rose over the 5th Academy. In the office, the director looked at the guy with displeasure, folding his arms across his chest. "I'm already a student and have every right to enroll," Nick said indignantly, looking at the man. The director grinned, but it was a rather sinister grin. "I just wanted you to live sensitively a little longer," he replied calmly, and stood up from his desk, pushing back his chair. "But you, no matter how I look at it, are eager to die." A piece of paper flies into Nicholas's face. The dark-haired man winces and, puffing, bends down to pick up the piece of paper. It said Death Waiver Agreement. The detector brought a cup of tea to his lips and added, "That's right. If you want to take part in the exam, you need to sign this paper." "That's it," Nick muttered over and over, his eyes scanning the line, Death Waiver Agreement. "If you're afraid of dying, get lost. Don't waste my time," the director suddenly shouted. Nicholas looked up, glaring at the man, his gaze burning right through him. The dark-haired man walked quickly along the corridor, weaving between the students. A satisfied smile shone on his face, already anticipating what would happen next. As soon as he entered the director's office, a piece of paper with a signature landed on his desk, stating that he agreed to participate in the exam. The door closed behind the guy. The director took a deep breath and walked over to the panoramic window, whispering, "Do the brats seriously think this will be a regular exam?" The corners of his lips turned up, revealing his snow-white teeth, and he added, "I hope they don't regret it later." Meanwhile, in Nicholas's hometown, Nicole slowly sat up, still trying to wake up. She rubbed her eyes with her fist, washing away the last remnants of sleep. Her bare foot landed on the wooden floor, and she walked slowly into the kitchen. She rubbed and squeezed her neck with her palms. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed the dishes standing on the table and ran up to them. But instead of fragrant dishes, the first thing she picked up was a note. This note was from Nick, where he wrote in a clumsy handwriting, "There is an event at the academy. I will return in 3 days. Nicole exhaled sadly, and only one question popped into her head. Will everything be okay with him? The Fifth Academy, Martial Arts Training Ground Number 5, was a rather gloomy place. Crows were flying everywhere, only adding to the tension in the atmosphere. The buildings kept creaking loudly as if they were about to collapse. When Nicholas arrived, he saw about 100 participants, but that was clearly not all. In a remote corner, the team of the Fifth Academy had gathered, and the guy was heading towards it. Quite a lot of people showed up, Nick said, looking around the training ground. Of course, all 5 academies took part. Greg responded cheerfully, approaching his friend. Students of the Fifth Academy? A smile played on the long-haired guy's face. Were the worthless ones allowed to participate in the upcoming exam? Next to him stood a tall man with blonde hair. Most likely it was his bodyguard, because the guy was dressed in a beautiful red suit, which spoke of his status. Sir, during the exam, you can hunt both animals and participants. The fewer weaklings, the better. The guard's rough voice rang out. The dark-haired man laughed quietly and looked at the students of the Fifth Academy again. Greg still wouldn't let up, telling Nick about the other students. His finger jerked sharply towards the long-haired man and he said, "See that guy? That's Darren, the genius of the First Academy. In his family, he is the strongest of the younger generation." Nick looked at Darren and chuckled, quietly saying, "Ah, so he's from the First Academy. Then it's no wonder he's so arrogant." Suddenly, there was the sound of a ball scraping on the asphalt. Many of the students turned around, and Darren and his guard followed suit. The heel hit the ground with such a loud sound that the guy attracted even more attention. "Darren, come here! I'll stab you to death!" he shouted loudly. The long-haired man only smirked at such a threat and calmly said, "You again? I kicked your ass 10 times, aren't you tired of it yet?" A grin spread across the guy's face. The loud cries caused the crows to fly over the training ground. "Who is he?" Nick asked, looking at the guy in surprise. Greg frowned and said quietly, as if afraid that he would be heard, "This is Wright, the genius swordsman of the Second Academy, who has been fighting Darren several times in the past." The principal noticed the tension between the students, clicked his tongue and spat saliva on the ground. "Completely detached from life," he shouted, looking at everyone who was now in front of him. Nicholas shrugged nervously, meeting the director's gaze. Come on, Wright, I believe in you," Nick suddenly shouted, raising his hands up. Wright, in turn, looked at the dark-haired man with an uncomprehending look. A mechanical voice came from the loudspeaker. "Fights outside the wilderness zone are prohibited. Violators will be disqualified." "You're lucky," Wright growled through his teeth. He quickly twisted the sword in his fingers. "As soon as we get into the zone, I won't leave a single living place on you." He turned around and walked away from Darren. The student of the First Academy only laughed loudly. Wright stamped his foot, stopping next to the students of the Fifth Academy. "Hey boy, I see you're brave since you dared to encourage me in front of Darren. Name yourself?" He put his hands on his hips, looking at the guys in front of him. "Nicholas, from the Fifth Academy," the boy answered in a calm voice. Wright's eyes widened and he let out a soft gasp. "What a good name. A leaf blocking the sun? Where have you ever seen such a thing?" His eyes slightly opened in surprise. A window of Wright's status popped up in front of Nick, where his qualities were written: Human Wright, talent for accomplishment, low level, talent for fencing, average level. The dark-haired man looked at the status window and a wonderful thought was born in his head. He extended his hand forward. "I hope you bring Darren to the exam," Nicholas said with a grin on his face. Wright first looked at the guy's outstretched palm in surprise, and then nodded with satisfaction. "Good luck to you too. Survive there." The guy also extended his palm. Their hands touched, and a pleasant vibration passed through Nick's palm. The status window changed to "Fencing talent successfully copied." The loudspeaker again blared a mechanical voice. "The exam has begun." Two large men began to push the large wooden gate, and the voice from the loudspeaker said again, "Students from the First Academy, come in." The students, wearing red uniforms, quickly rushed towards the opening gates, and the first one to come out of the gate was none other than Darren, with his guard. His gaze was determined. He had no intention of retreating. "Finally, the exam has begun," Greg exclaimed joyfully and placed his weapon on his shoulder. "I'm going to my team. See you later, Nicholas," Wright said, watching Greg run as fast as he could towards the gate. Nick nodded. The guy stretched and groaned, adding, "First the First Academy, then ours, the Second, and you, the Fifth Academy, are starting last. Yeah, I don't envy you." Wright waved his hand one last time and walked away to his team. Nicholas just rolled his eyes at his statement. A couple of hours later, the dark-haired man was already running quickly through the dark forest. His gaze was focused. He made quick movements, pushing off from large tree trunks and jumping long distances. In a remote part of the forest, he landed on the ground. Throwing the backpack off his shoulders, the status window lit up in front of him again, and on it were the words, "Intermediate-level swordsmanship talent successfully copied, Start Fusion." As soon as Nick pressed the word yes, his hand tensed, and the veins stood out. Nicholas even heard the crunch of bones, but it was no longer so painful. He clenched his teeth harder and just waited. Soon the pain took its toll. The guy collapsed to the ground, pressing his palms into the damp earth. The veins on his face also bulged from the tension. Suddenly, a loud sound was heard throughout the forest, and a second later, everything became quiet. Nicholas exhaled and opened his eyes, feeling relieved. His hand immediately grabbed the handle of the ball. With a whistle, the sword left the case that was hanging in the boy's bosom. With just one movement, Nick cut through several large trees in his path. With a loud thud, they fell to the ground, leaving behind only gnarled stumps and dust. Nick checked his talent status, which now read Human, Nicholas, Enhancement Talent, Intermediate, Speed Talent, Basic, Swordsmanship Talent, Intermediate. Smiling at his small victory, he slung his backpack over his shoulder again and moved on. The loudspeaker again announced, "The first 4 academies have entered the zone. Next, the 5th Academy." The students of the 5th Academy resolutely headed towards the large wooden gates. Nicholas walked along an empty road, with only black crows flying around him. His boot hit the ground and a stick crunched under his feet. The guy didn't pay any attention to this and continued on his way. Suddenly, behind the dark-haired man, there was a quiet rustling sound, similar to someone dragging a bag along the asphalt. Without thinking twice, Nick pulled out his sword. Turning around, he saw a huge snake in front of him. It was at least 3 meters long. The tip of the ball touched the ground, raising dirt and dust. Nicholas took a determined step towards the snake, which in turn hissed fiercely. The guy preparing to attack swung. In an instant, Nick cuts the snake in half, sending blue blood flying everywhere. A couple of cables hit the student's cheek as he landed on the ground. The spotted snake froze and collapsed to the ground, holding on for a moment before dying. Approaching the corpse of the monster, Nick immediately took its eye. It was one of the items needed for the test proving that he killed the spotted snake. The guy quickly stuffed the trophy into his bag. Nick sighed heavily and muttered, "There's a long way to go." Pushing off from the ground, he soared upward, continuing on his way. The sky lit up with pink colors, indicating that it would soon become completely dark. As he headed deeper into the wilderness, Nicholas began to hear faint cries for help. The guy landed on one of the destroyed buildings. Not far from him were about a dozen toothy wolves besieging Greg, several corpses still lying on the ground. "It's him!" Seeing his friend, the dark-haired man's eyes widened. Greg was in a very bad condition. His body was filled with blood. His face was very pale. He was holding an axe in his hands and constantly swinging it. The wolf only growled and rushed at the student. "This is bad," Nick whispered as he saw a pair of wolves rushing after Greg. Taking an arrow out of the quiver, the boy took his bow and aimed at the toothy wolf. The arrow whistled straight towards the target. It hit the toothy wolf's body and he fell to the ground. Greg, not understanding what was happening, just stood there and trembled with fear. With a loud sound, Nicholas fell to the ground, covering his frightened friend with his body. "Help in exchange for points, okay?" The guy glanced over his shoulder at Greg. Nick?" the dark-haired man asked, stuttering, not believing his eyes. "Nick, run! You can't handle a fanged wolf!" Greg suddenly shouted. Nicholas quickly rushed forward, only smiling at his friend's words. He went around these toothy wolves 1.5 times faster while they were trying to somehow injure the guy. He maneuvered between them every now and then, leaving the monsters behind. The dark-haired man took his sword out of its case. The look became more serious than ever. Thanks to his talent for fencing, he was able to accurately time the attack and deliver a fatal blow. Every time he swung, he would definitely take the lives of the monsters. Seeing the blood splashes, his gaze changed from more serious to more insane. The sight made Greg's pupils dilate and his throat tighten. After a while, the bodies of a dozen toothy rolls were already lying on the ground, and Nicholas's uniform was covered in blood. Touching the tip of the sword to the wolf's mouth, the guy cut off one of the fangs with a light movement. Nick took it in his palm, dabbing the blood with his fingers and put the sword away. "As we agreed, I'll take the points for the wolves for myself," the guy said, putting the fang in his backpack, looking at his friend, but he only nodded. Throwing his bag over his shoulder, he turned to Greg and asked, "Planning on continuing?" The student plopped down on the ground and exhaled. "Nah, I'm done. The exam turned out to be much more dangerous than I initially imagined. I'm lucky I survived it all," Greg added, wiping sweat from his forehead. My teammates are seriously injured. We need to get them out of here as soon as possible. He nodded towards the students lying nearby, bleeding. It seems that this is the only thing you can do now. Having said this, Nicholas was about to leave. At this point, Greg's expression changed and he shouted, "Nick, wait! Pseudo-monsters are being introduced into the depths of the zone. Be careful," the guy added, thereby attracting Nicholas's attention. "Pseudo-monsters?" the guy asked again and turned to his friend again. There was a gradation of creatures on the territory. First there was a beast, then a pseudo-monster, and the most important was a monster. Greg gritted his teeth and said, "I heard that the students of the First Academy decided to attack a snake that was more than 10 meters long, and it was one of the pseudo-monsters." He didn't know whether it was good or bad to tell this news to Nick. "You'll get 500 points for killing him," he added with a sigh, looking at his friend. 500? Nicholas asked again, excitement playing in his eyes. He was clearly shocked by this news. Grabbing Greg by the fabric of his uniform across his chest, Nick growled, "Where is he now?" With a trembling hand, the guy pointed somewhere ahead and quietly added, "In the southeast." Nick followed his friend's finger with his gaze, peering into the distance. Nick pushed off the ground and rushed forward, leaving Greg in the dust. 500 points don't just fall on the ground. If I get them, first place will be mine." Nick's eyebrows drew together, and his gaze became more gloomy. "Nick, take care of yourself." Greg looked at his friends disappearing back and took a deep breath. Nick, like lightning, rushed through the ruins that looked like houses. After running some more distance, he stopped. His eyes widened and his breathing became ragged. The corpses of his students lay around him. This is the uniform of the students of the First Academy. The thought flashed through Nick's head when he noticed the red tint of the vest on one of the corpses. The sound of an explosion could be heard in the distance, and just by the sound one could understand how intense the battle was. "He's there." The guy's hair rustled from a strong gust of wind. Pushing off the ground, he covered a great distance in one jump. About 30 seconds later, Nicholas arrived at the scene, hiding on one of the rooftops. There was a look of complete bewilderment in his eyes as he looked at the battlefield. There were 10 students on the field, besieging a wounded purple snake, which was not 10 meters long, as Greg said, but reached 12 meters. "Forward!" came Darren's voice amidst the blazing fire. "We must finish this creature," he added, and together with his guard, he rushed into battle. His sword struck the snake's scales with a loud thud. "Mr. Snake's stamina is running out. Now is the time to kill him." The blonde man peered and also dealt several blows to the monster's body. The spotted snake roared loudly. He was hit by a lot of arrows. He had a lot of living and sword wounds. The soles of Darren's boots entered the monster's liquid, slimy blood. "Great! I'll take care of the rest." The long-haired man quickly pushed off the ground. His figure towered directly over the monster. He swung his sword in mid-flight. The instant blow went straight to the frontal part, leaving behind a splatter of blood. The spotted snake growled loudly in pain. A smile lit up Darren's face as he began to rejoice, when the monster's huge tail threw him far away. He landed with a loud thud on one of the destroyed buildings. "The 500 points will still be mine," Darren said, groaning in pain. The monster fell to the ground with a loud thud. "Is he dead?" Nick asked himself, watching all this from afar. The guy punched the concrete next to him. "Damn! If I had come a little earlier," Nicholas muttered to himself through clenched teeth, looking at the snake's body. Darren pushed the rock away from himself with all his might, climbing out from under the rubble. "Congratulations, sir," said the guard. The long-haired man walked past the students and they bowed before him. A smile appeared on his face and he laughed quietly. "First place is now rightfully mine," he shouted, clenching his fist. Suddenly there was a loud roar. The fierce spotted snake activated its blood power just like the silver wolf and rose from the ground. With a flick of his tail, he sent several students flying in one fell swoop. Darren and his blonde guard immediately tensed up as they saw several students flying away from the monster. "Got into a bloody outburst state?" Darren's face twisted, and his gaze became even more ominous than before. The next moment, the spotted beast disappeared into the distance, and the dark-haired one shouted, "This is not a pseudo-monster, but a full-fledged monster." "Then should we pursue him?" one of the students shouted, and Darren turned around sharply, barking, "Of course! He's worth 1,000 points." "1,000?" the students asked again, shock evident on their faces. "Forward! We can't let anyone else get ahead of us," Darren shouted again, and the students from his academy rushed forward. He himself also followed them, wanting to catch the monster as soon as possible. "Wow! I never thought a monster worth 1,000 points would appear here," Nick said excitedly, and several small flashes formed around him. "Sorry guys, but I'm faster," he smiled, looking back at the students of the First Academy. The guy's palm landed on the cold concrete, purple sparks still emanating from it. "Talent for speed to the max!" sparkled around, and Nick dropped to the ground, standing in a pose, preparing to rush forward. His gaze became as crazy as it had been then, and his eyebrows frowned, forming wrinkles on the bridge of his nose. He rushed forward so quickly that after him, stones flew in all directions. Like a rocket, Nicholas used his speed to fly past the destroyed buildings. The spotted snake left a trail of blood behind it, as it moved resolutely in a direction familiar to it. Nick sank down onto the asphalt, pushing his hands and the soles of his boots into the concrete, or rather what was left of it. "The students of the First Academy have not arrived yet. Excellent," he said quietly, and noticed with his gaze a huge trail of blood. Squatting on one knee, he touched the purple liquid with his fingertip. An unpleasant and cold substance touched the guy's skin, causing goosebumps. Without paying any attention to it, he put his finger to his nose and sniffed the air as if he were a sniffer dog. Rising from his knees, he looked around the huge building, on which hung a worn poster discounts up to 30%. Most likely it was once a shopping center. "It looks like I'll get 1,000 points, thought Nicholas, and smiled at the corner of his lips at his own thoughts, while his gaze carefully examined the building. There was purple mucus everywhere, and it gave off an unpleasant, even stinking smell. Nick took a step forward, and his boot stepped into the liquid that the ferocious snake had left behind. "That creature is somewhere nearby." The dark-haired man confidently walked forward, but he also looked around, carefully examining the mountains of garbage around him, in the hope that the beast was hiding behind them. Finding nothing outside, he went into the room. The room was deep and stretched to the very... Noticing the monster, Nick froze in place. The spotted snake stretched out like a string, throwing its head back and opening its huge mouth. Some kind of white liquid was dripping from the ceiling, or more precisely from the sharp end of the stone. The beast swallowed it greedily, catching the droplets with its tongue, which glittered in the light. "What is he drinking?" Nicholas frowned, still standing rooted to the spot, as if studying the beast's actions. Clearly not ordinary water. The guy looked askance at the monster, or rather at what he was drinking. The liquid was transparent, but with flashes of something white. With a ringing sound, Nick pulled out a sword from his bosom, which flashed in the light. "Okay, I'll think about it after I get 1,000 points, he said loudly, and pulled his elbow back, taking a defensive stance. Nick ran so fast that it seemed like his feet barely touched the ground. Distracted from his occupation, the monster turned to the young man, showing with his whole appearance that he was ready to defend himself. Nick flew up above the beast, confidently heading towards his face. Well, even though the snake was wounded, it quickly dodged the guy's attack. Her huge fist fell to the ground, shaking everything around. Stones flew up, and Nicholas with them. Unable to control his body, he flipped over in the air several times. He pulled out a bow from behind his back, and then also took the arrows into his nimble fingers. Pulling the bowstring, the guy takes aim, gathering all his abilities together. 3 arrows flew straight towards the target, cutting through the air. There was a loud roar as they hit the bullseye, or rather the monster's eye sockets. Nicholas landed not far from the beast, one leg forward and the other bent at the knee, his bow and arrows flying a little further. Without saying a word, Nick grabbed the handle of the ball and squeezed it tightly in his palm. Using his speed talent, he flew towards the monster again, not giving it a chance to recover. This only angered the beast. It swung its clawed paw, but Nicholas quickly dodged. The sharp end of the sword quickly pierced the ferocious snake's hand, and it let out a loud cry of pain. It wasn't enough. Nick continued to push the sword deeper into the monster. My hands were already at their limit. They were shaking, hurting, and the veins on my skin were bulging. Nicholas screamed loudly, channeling all his strength into his sword to finish off the monster. Their voices were mixed up. Chaos reigned all around. Blood was pouring like a fountain onto the concrete. The sharp end of the sword passed through the spotted snake, emerging from it at the other end. Nicholas removed the murder weapon from the body and quickly lowered himself down. The snake's lifeless body fell onto the concrete with a loud slam, leaving a pool of blood underneath. "Phew," Nick exhaled, smiling triumphantly. "The monsters are insanely strong. If Darren's group hadn't weakened him, I would never have managed." The guy picked up his backpack and squinted at the sharp stone from which white liquid was dripping. If this is what he came here for, then it's definitely a very valuable thing. Nicholas took out of his briefcase a small, round glass bottle with a wooden stopper. Uncorking it, he gently lowered the bottle right in front of the stone so that the liquid now dripped straight inside. The sharp end of the sword he thrust into the lifeless body of the monster again. Puffing and grunting, Nicholas twirled the sword a couple of times, as if drawing some kind of pattern. The eyeballs will serve as proof of murder. He placed in his palm the monster's large eye, which in turn was bleeding stinking purple blood. And the blood from the monster's heart is incredibly valuable. Nicholas slashed his sword across the beast's flesh again. Green liquid began to pour out of his heart, and the boy quickly held out the bottle to fill it to the brim. "That's enough," Nick said, shaking the bottle slightly so that the colored blood slapped against the inner walls in a wave. The dark-haired man turned around and looked again at the sharp stone hanging down, with white liquid pouring down it. With a slight movement of his hand, he swung, cutting through the air. The sharp end of the sword quickly passed over the stone, splitting it in half. With a loud thud, one half fell to the concrete floor. Nicholas squatted down next to his bag, muttering under his breath, "The points I've earned are more than enough for first place." A happy smile played across his face as he remembered that Darren was supposed to be here soon. They took the eyeballs. They sucked the blood out of the heart. The students of the First Academy screamed, looking at the corpse of the monster. "There's only a corpse left! Sir, what should we do?" the guard shouted, looking back at his long-haired man. Who was that?" His knuckles turned white and his palms shook, clenching into fists. "Who dared to steal my 1,000 points? I will destroy him!" Darren shouted, making veins appear on his forehead. The sky was still shimmering in pink tones, but the weather worsened. It started to rain, or rather, to pour. Nicholas sat on one of the roofs, safely hidden in the shadows, and quietly watched the team of the First Academy. He fluttered slightly, like a sparrow in the rain, noticing the students leaving the building. The rain kept falling, but they didn't care. They were too upset, too angry. "Sir, that bastard who stole your victory points must be hiding somewhere and waiting. What should we do?" A tall man walked behind Darren, still asking questions. "Search everyone we meet along the way. I have to find this little rat." The rain fell on Darren and his black hair turned into hanging icicles. "We can't let him get away," he shouted, frowning and lines forming across the bridge of his nose. "Yes, sir," the students of the First Academy quickly responded. Nicola adjusted the strap of his backpack and chuckled thoughtfully. "It looks like I really should hide." Channeling his power, he rushed forward again, looking for a hiding place. He hovered over the collapsed buildings trying to find shelter because this could not continue for long. The exam will be over in 3 days. When the points are counted, everyone will immediately understand that I killed the monster. Various dark thoughts crept into his head. He landed smoothly on the ground, looking around at what looked like a business center before, "I think this place will work as a shelter." Entering the building, or rather what was left of it, Nick threw off his briefcase, placing it on the floor. The guy sat on the concrete in the lotus position and took a bottle of green liquid in his hands. Without thinking twice, he threw his head back, raised the neck of the bottle to his lips and began to drink. Nicholas winced and whispered quietly, sniffing the air. "Oh, if only I could have some peanuts to snack on so it wouldn't be so disgusting. I don't care. For my sister's safety, I need to get stronger. To the bottom." The boy squeezed the bottle tighter in his palm. Holding his breath, he brought the neck of the bottle to his mouth again and began to take more intense sips in order to empty the bottle faster. Meanwhile, Nicole sneezed loudly, closing her eyes. She wiped her nose with her finger, sniffed, and quietly said, "Does anyone remember me?" Nicole put her hand under her cheek and looked sadly out the window onto the grounds of the school where she studied. Nicholas placed his palms opposite each other and began to direct streams of energy towards each other, thereby forming a whirlpool. Opening his eyes, he looked around and his happiness knew no bounds. "Holy shit! The speed of improvement has increased by 4 times, he shouted, watching the bluish streams of energy around him. No wonder Ben and the others are improving so fast. It's not just talent, it's using the tools, the boy thought as he looked at his bag. It contained a couple of bottles of blood from the monster's heart. Small and large eyeballs, no one would have such trophies. 3 days later, everyone gathered at the site, the judges sat at their tables, and each participant approached them and showed their findings. John, 10 points. Carl, 23 points. Leo, 0 points. The teacher was counting the points, writing them down on her sheet. She looked up at Leo, who was standing with a wounded face and obviously guessed the reason. A greenish backpack fell onto the teacher's desk with a loud sound. "Master, help me count this." Wright pointed at the bag with 2 fingers, grinning smugly. The backpack was almost filled to the brim with all sorts of materials, from glowing eyes to sharp fangs. "Wright, 195 points, the girl said loudly, examining the bag. When Wright's glasses were announced, the students of the Second Academy were proud of themselves, because Wright came from their academy. A measly 195 points. What's so cool about that? Darren's voice was heard, smiling mockingly as he walked towards the table with a large bag on his back. Right, you're not alive, you're so strong, he added, and laughed loudly, looking at his opponent. You plan to compete with me with such a pitiful amount of points? Darren's lips twitched into a mocking smile. Darren! Wright hissed through his teeth like a snake, drawing his eyebrows together. Count this. The long-haired man unceremoniously poured all his trophies onto the table, shaking out the bag so that nothing was left in it. The teacher's eyes widened and she began to count the materials, then timidly, stuttering, Darren, 427 points. The students of the academy began to whisper among themselves, looking frozenly at the table. Wow, as many as 427. I didn't expect anything less from Darren. Such a big gap. I only have 30 points. Wright pointed at Darren with a sharp wave of his hand and loudly shouted, You shameless bastard! You just took the glasses from others. The long-haired man laughed at this insult and replied, I took them thanks to my talents. Bastard, the guy growled. Wright's anger pouring out as soon as Darren loomed on the horizon. Congratulations, sir. With so many points, you'll definitely get first place. One of the girls from the first academy chimed in, coming closer to Darren. The guy rolled his eyes and sarcastically said, No, first place will have over 1,000. The girl put her finger to her lips, looking away thoughtfully. The students who are still alive should have all come out by now? Asked the teacher from the 5th academy and looked at the girl who was counting the points with her hands in her pockets. Yeah, if someone didn't come out, then they're probably already dead, she replied, tucking a lock of purple hair behind her ear. So Darren took first place, the man grinned, since he was the one who ran every year. Just as the allotted time was drawing to an end, Nicholas emerged from the wilderness, carrying a large backpack on his back. What? The teacher from the 5th academy turned around after hearing the sound of feet, heading towards the table where he was standing. 36 Nick's step was graceful but firm. The intense gaze was directed only at the teacher who was counting the points. The boy's main trophies landed on the table. Several fangs, 2 small eyes of the beast, and 2 large eyes of the monster. This is a monster's eyeball, the teacher said loudly, examining the boy's findings. Right, so how many points do I have? Nick asked, looking up at her with an indifferent voice. Nicholas, 1,036 points. Congratulations, you won first place in the exam this year. The blonde girl handed the reward to the guy and added, Your reward is 3 bottles of mid-level monster blood and 100,000 wien. Nick, you're a great guy, Greg yelled at the top of his lungs, genuinely happy for his friend. The leader of the 2nd academy, Wright, only thoughtfully scratched his chin, asking the question, How did he manage to do this? Here he is. Just think, it was a puppy from the 5th academy, Darren said through his teeth, glaring at Nicholas. Dig up everything you can from that bastard, the long-haired man ordered, not taking his eyes off the boy, and his guard quickly replied, Yes, sir. At that time, gossip and whispering among the team of the 5th academy did not subside, especially Greg heated them up, bragging that Nick was his close friend. What an idiot, muttered the teacher of the 5th academy, putting his hands in his pockets. And Greg only snorted at these words, Teacher, you are not very happy. Nick brought glory to the 5th academy after all. The man chuckled under his breath, and the corners of his lips twitched in a weak smirk. He insulted and angered Darren's family, and they are very powerful and influential. I'm afraid your friend may soon die suddenly. The joy instantly disappeared from Greg's face and he just dropped his nose to the floor. On the leaderboard, the names of the top 3 were displayed, and on the left were written out the rewards, which were, for 3rd place, 3 bottles of blood of a monster of nobody's level plus 50k yuan. For 2nd place, 1 bottle of blood of a monster of the middle level plus 100k yuan. And for 1st place, 3 bottles of blood of a monster of the middle level plus 100k yuan. The camera shone in the sun like new, as if it had just been bought. Look here and smile, said the girl, and smiles appeared on the faces of the 3 winners. The exam is officially over. Congratulations to the top 3 on their well-deserved awards, said a mechanical voice over the loudspeaker, and a camera clicked. Puppy, you are very brave to steal something that belongs to someone else. Darren turned to Nicholas, looking him up and down. Likewise, the guy answered calmly and smiled fleetingly. Hey Darren, have you forgotten your own words? Wright intervened in the conversation, looking at his opponent. I'm not talking to you. Although, what did I say there? The long-haired man asked, wincing. Like you, Nicholas took these glasses thanks to his talents, Wright replied, and put his hands on his hips. and in response he heard only Darren's nasty laugh. "Who do you think is stronger than us, huh?" he added, smiling slyly. "Maybe we can find out in battle?" Darren took a step forward, getting closer to Nick. "If you have time for it, I'd be happy to," Nicholas said rudely, turning up his nose. The grin played across Darren's face again. It was there so often it was almost like it was ingrained in him. The dark-haired man looked at him from under his brows, frowning even more deeply in his already frowning gaze. 3 days later, Nicholas returned to his hometown to see his sister. His hand dropped smoothly onto the door handle and there was a click. "Nicole, I'm home!" Nick walked into the living room, closing the door behind him and taking off his sneakers. A soft patter of feet could be heard throughout the house, but the sound increased as the girl approached. "Brother!" Nicole exclaimed, hugging the boy tightly, pressing her cheek to his chest. "Where have you been for so long?" She raised her large, surprised eyes to her brother. "Are you hurt? Let me see." Nicole started running around her brother, looking at every detail on him. Nick quickly shook his head. "No, of course, I'm perfectly fine." "By the way, I brought you some presents," he added, and grabbed the strap of his backpack, and his sister in turn smiled brightly, looking at her brother. 3 cups with the scarlet blood of a mid-level monster, a book with a beautiful cover, a bottle with a green liquid, a wad of money, and a broken piece of stalactite fell to the floor. Nicole took the bills in her palm and looked at her brother, whispering, "This will give you enough for your wedding?" "What wedding?" "They are for you. Pay for your tuition and take some for pocket money." Nick sat down on the floor in front of his sister, tucking his legs under him. What is this?" The girl quickly took the bottle with green liquid in her hands. "To be honest, I have no idea. That's why I bought the illustrated guide to jewelry." Nick pointed to the book and then picked it up. "A jewelry reference book? Let me see it." Nicole's mouth dropped open in surprise, and she poked her curious nose into the book her brother had just opened. Nick's eyes widened when he saw the name of what he brought home. The text in the book read, "Treasure name, Earth Core Elixir. Effect, liquid essence formed by Terranite stones that have absorbed the chi energy of the heavens and Earth for hundreds of years. When consumed, it can enhance one's cultivation talent. However, the elixir is only effective for below intermediate talents." Nick frowned, remembering the ferocious spotted snake greedily gulping down the liquid in the abandoned building, and a thought flashed through his mind. That snake must have evolved into a monster by consuming that elixir. I never thought that the thing I got so easily would be a valuable item. "Hold on!" Nicole's voice brought his brother out of his lofty thoughts. He looked up and saw a bottle in front of him. "This stuff can improve talents. It will be good for you to drink it," the sister said, examining the green liquid at the bottom of the glass bottle, still holding it out to Nick. "No, I don't need her anymore." Nicholas shook his head, his black hair falling carelessly over his face. "We'd better make you stronger, Nicole." His voice sounded a little rough, and his gaze became more penetrating. "What? Me?" the dark-haired girl exclaimed, beads of sweat appearing on her forehead. She was clearly nervous. The sun slowly sinks below the horizon, bathing the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. "Do you want me to drink this?" came the sister's voice again, so loudly that most likely the passers-by on the street heard it. They sat opposite each other. In front of him lay the trophies that Nick had obtained on the screen. The girl still could not believe that her brother was saying this seriously, because her talent had not yet awakened. "We'll just be wasting the elixir," Nicole said as she looked at the bottle in her hands. And a window of her status appeared in front of Nicholas, showing that her cultivation talent was at the basic level, and her freezing talent had not yet been awakened. Nick thoughtfully put his finger to his chin and directed his gaze to the floor, quietly humming under his breath. "Listen, we can sell it. It's probably worth a lot of money," the girl drawled, raising her brown eyes to her brother. "That won't do. The book says about the original Terranite stones that can appear where this essence was formed, but I destroyed them." Nicholas shook his head and stood up from the floor, still holding the book in his hands. He took a couple of steps towards the sofa, adding, "Sooner or later people will come who want to buy these stones, and they are unlikely to believe my story after all. This will expose us to danger and bring us much trouble," he continued, and with a light movement of his hand, he threw the book onto the sofa, so that with a light thud it fell onto the soft surface. Why did you destroy them?" "What a pity," Nicole asked, and Nick just rolled his eyes. The girl's talent was clearly in pretending to be stupid at the right time. The dark-haired man grabbed the bottle by the neck and almost tore it out of his sister's hands, uncorking the neck. "It would be even more of a shame if you didn't drink it." Nicholas shook the glass from side to side, so that the liquid began to splatter against the glass walls, and Nicole only opened her mouth to object to her brother. The guy grabbed her cheeks roughly so that her mouth opened even wider, and at that moment tension hung in the air. Nick said in a serious tone, "Open your mouth! Help! They're killing me!" she screamed. The girl began shaking her head in different directions and also waving her arms in order to somehow get rid of her brother's dead grip. Soon the bottle was empty and lay on the floor, sparkling in the sun, as if it had collected all the sun's rays. "Well, how does it taste?" Nicholas smiled triumphantly and stroked his sister's back soothingly while she tried to understand the taste on the tip of her tongue. "Huh? Warm and so refreshing," she answered, and looked at her brother with the same big, happy, dark brown eyes, while tiny sparks flickered around. Nicole's answer didn't please Nicholas, and his eyebrows furrowed in lightning speed. The pupils of his eyes were directed at his sister, and his brain couldn't understand what was happening. Her status window remained unchanged. No increase in strength occurred. The same basic talent for improvement, and an unawakened talent for freezing. "Something makes me feel sleepy. I'll cook you something to eat later," the dark-haired girl said quietly and yawned, rubbing her eye with her fist. "Rest," the guy replied, and in his head the thought was spinning. "It's strange. Why did this happen? Maybe I just need to wait."